All right, good afternoon to all our viewers. Welcome to the Elma Francois Research Institute's series of webinars. This week, George Weeks, we are celebrating. So this is our tribute to the life and times of George Weeks. Our format of our session will be as follows for the week. This week, the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies joins the labor movement in commemorating the centenary of former labor leader George Weeks. Join us from today, June 21st to the 24th, as we host a series of webinars under the theme Week for Weeks. Today, Monday, we are celebrating the life of George Weeks. Tomorrow, at 9 a.m., we'll be looking at public goods, commodification, and inequity. On Wednesday, we'll be looking at trade unions, just for transitions. And on Thursday, radical ideology and the Caribbean working class institutions from 5. But before we get into today's session, we would like to introduce you or to welcome you to the program, the Director of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, Dr. Andre Henry, to give a few opening remarks. Dr. Henry, you can unmute and you can start.
Thank you very much, Marsha. I want to first thank and welcome Comrade Roger, Dr. Luxing, Mr. Kanbon, Aussie Warwick. I think that those are our panelists. Yes. And I want to segue almost immediately into congratulating my colleagues, Atkins Vidal and Ian Daniel, the head of our Labor Studies Department, and their collaborators within the institution for conceptualizing this series that commemorates and seeks to interpret the trends through the life and legacy of George Weeks. This is for us a very important thing for us to remember who we are, where we've come from, and to see what lessons we can learn as we navigate what are particularly difficult and challenging times in an environment that is becoming increasingly hostile. So I think without further ado, I want to thank everyone who is here with us. I want to welcome you to the college, if virtually. And I certainly look forward to the time when we'll be able to meet in person before not too long, hopefully. Thank you, Marsha.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Dr. Henry. Up next, I'd like to welcome the President General of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union and the President of the Joint Trade Union Movement, Comrade Ansel Rocher, to give some opening remarks as well.
Thank you very much, Marsha, Chair of this very significant event here this afternoon that we are conducting virtually. Well, let me recognize, first of all, the Director of the Cipriani College of Labor, Dr. Andre Henry, Dr. and Comrade Jerome T. Luxing, Senior Lecturer at the University of the West Indies. Let me also recognize Brother Kafra Kanbon, Regional Coordinator for the Caribbean Pan-African Network, and our very own Comrade Aussie Warwick, Chief Education and Research Officer of the Alphys Workers Trade Union and also General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement of Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, let me pay my respects to you, Marsha, for being the chair of this very important undertaking this afternoon. Let me start by thanking the Cipriani College of Labor for hosting what we consider to be a continuum in the drive to educate and to raise the consciousness of our people, because there hardly exists many mediums these days to connect the past with the present and therefore forecast where we will end up depending on the position we take, but that we can be very well informed and guided by some of the things that would have occurred in the past. And those very important and one may say significant individuals who would have stood up against all else and take fundamental positions that had the country benefit. And in that regard, recognizing the 100-year anniversary of the birth of our third President in General, Comrade Weeks, we think that is significant, but we feel honored to do that. And let me also say it is with pride, honor, and indeed privilege, I accept the invitation to be part of these discussions here this afternoon. Comrade Weeks was the third President General of this 84-year-old union. And in an environment that was always hostile, still hostile, and for the longest while, until we change that dynamic, will continue to be hostile. And so Comrade Weeks, in our view, would have turned the tide and changed history, and of course, change the thinking of the population by raising the consciousness. Because at that time, when Comrade Weeks would have come into the leadership of the union, there were a lot of awareness. And one can argue that we still have a lot of people aware of what is happening, the problems that we are experiencing. But why we are experiencing those problems and raising the consciousness, the level of consciousness of the people, Comrade Weeks would have been successful in leading national campaigns to do that. Comrade Weeks was very well respected internationally for the contribution that he made and for the campaigns, various campaigns that he would have led the union in terms of benefiting not just the union and our members, but for the country at large. It was larger than life itself. And therefore the position that Comrade Weeks would have taken on the critical issue of nationalization of our energy sector, our oil industry. Because remember, prior to Comrade Weeks taking the leadership of the union, we would have had a number of struggles. And today we are not taking away from what went before, but those struggles dealt with the oppression and the oppressive nature of the workers in this country, and so on, the terms and conditions, all of the unsafe, how they exploited, the multinationals exploited our people. But Comrade Weeks, instead of just settling for increasing the terms and conditions of the workers, for the workers to get better benefits, what he saw was something bigger than that. And what he saw was the nationalizing of the oil industry, because his was the position that it belongs to the people, and therefore the people must benefit. And therefore we must not just own it, but we must control it. Own and control for the people to benefit. And that would have led to us owning and indeed really controlling a great chunk of the energy sector and the oil sector in this country. Many people would have benefited, whether they are conscious or they are unaware. Many people would have benefited from the type of leadership and the type of conviction of Comrade Weeks, our union's third President General. But may I just take 1 minute again to say, how did he do that? Comrade Weeks recognized that to be able to achieve the benefit of this monumental undertaking, there must be a campaign, a consistent national educational drive where people will understand the benefits of what was being given away and how they as individuals would benefit. And what he did, he would have introduced for the first time in the union a major department called the Education and Research Department, where he would have brought in young university graduates and so on, the likes of Teddy Belgrave and David Abdullah and so on, and established that Education and Research Department, not just to train the officers and so on of the union, but to educate Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, that was part of his overall campaign. I want to also remind all that he was responsible for the full democratization of the Union. Prior to Comrade Weeks becoming the President General of the OWTU, we did not have the one man, one vote system in place. And he would have successfully introduced that, and the union would have benefited by that because we would have had greater involvement through that process of democracy in the union, and therefore that greater involvement would have led to most of the successes that we would have registered as a union. And so it perhaps is fortuitous that myself being the 5th President General of this great union, the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, my middle name is also George. And just a while ago, we were talking about the problems that Comrade Weeks would have experienced with respect to the media. The media and all of the historians would know they would have, in the interest of the multinationals and in the interest of the establishment, would have painted Comrade Weeks in the most negative light in his day, notwithstanding the fact that Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, would have benefited enormously. And so it is our position, our conviction, as I said on Labor Day, that ours must be to continue where Comrade Weeks would have left off and so on, and to continue to build the consciousness of our people so they will understand what it means to own and to control and so on for the benefit of all our citizens and for future generation. So posthumously, I would like to again thank Comrade Weeks and so on, and thank the union at that time for doing what was done, what was necessary to establish the type of foundation upon which the country rests, and certainly upon which the union rests, and for which I benefited, significant benefits to oil worker. But again, I could never overemphasize the point, that which Trinidad and Tobago benefit. So thank you, Cipriani College of Labor and Director Andre Henry. And you know, when we see prominent people in our society taking positions like this, like our comrade Jerome, who had long taken the progressive position and understanding, and I guess too because of the geography and where people are from, they understand it a little more. But when we see people taking that position, what we do, we confer upon them a title that cannot be conferred anywhere else. But when the OWTU confer the title of comrade on you, it's a very, very significant title. So Comrade Dr. Andre Henry, thank you and the college for hosting such a forum at a critical time in the history of the trade union movement in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Roger. At this time, I would like to start the presentations, but before we do that, just some house announcements or some housekeeping. For the participants or the viewers of this webinar, please feel free to ask the panel any questions on the presentations, and you can do that by typing in the chat box. You must be concise and clear, and let us know which panel member the question is directed to, and we'll also like you to subscribe, like the video, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, all right? So first up, we have our first presenter, Brother Kafra Kanbon. And in introducing him, this is what I will let our audience know. He became a well-known national figure in the Trinidad and Tobago in 1970 as one of the leaders of the Black Power movement, which brought positive social and economic changes to the country and stimulated changes throughout the English-speaking Caribbean. Professionally, Brother Kanbon is an economist. He is currently the regional coordinator of the Caribbean Pan-African Network, an umbrella body of regional civil society organizations formed in 2004 and linked to the Diaspora Initiative of the African Union. In 2009, he was appointed permanent representative to the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council of the African Union on behalf of Caribbean civil society. He also represented Caribbean civil society organizations at various meetings organized by the African Union. The Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago had the distinction of hosting the first meeting of an official body of the African Union outside of Africa when it hosted a meeting of the 𝐸CO-SOCC in 2011. In 2002, the government of Trinidad and Tobago awarded him the 𝐷𝐿𝐴 Medal Silver for community work, and he is the author of the book For Bread, Justice and Freedom, a political biography of George Weeks. His presentation will be celebrating the life of George Weeks' early life. Welcome to present to us this evening, Brother Kafra Kanbon.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Sister Chair. And greetings to all the distinguished persons that are part of this program this evening. We have the director of the Elma Francois Institute, I hope I'm right, saying director, Dr. Henry. We also have with us Jerome, Dr. Jerome Luxing, and we just heard from 𝐷𝐿𝐴 𝐷𝐿𝐴, the current President General of the OWTU, really a major union in this country. I say all protocols observed for the other guests who are here and whom I may not be aware of. Now, I've been asked to speak some words about George Weeks, his childhood, as well as, you know, the 1970 part of his activity, which is part union and part the rest of civil society, but that has always been George's life. He's been so absorbed in the union. At the same time, he has never ignored what was happening in the wider society. Now, I have heard many people criticize George Weeks in the post-1970 period, saying how he jumped into the Black Power movement, you know, as though he came on a bandwagon, and also go on to say, and he spoiled it. Now, the same was said about Clive Nunes and a few other radicals of the time. I was one of the leaders of the Black Power movement in Trinidad and Tobago, and in 1970 and in the early 70s. And for all the talk regarding people like George Weeks and so, who were great assets to the movement, I have never heard anyone able to explain how those persons spoiled the movement. I didn't know it was spoiled to start with. And this is something I want to clarify right off, because it is something that always weighs very heavily on my mind, as it did then. What I want to say, and I say it right at the outset here, is that George Weeks, very, very early, long before there was a National Joint Action Committee, or anything you could call a Black Power movement in Trinidad and Tobago, you know, George Weeks was the first major national figure to publicly and boldly display his commitment to Black Power. He did this in 1968. He did it in a manner that dramatically stimulated an awakening national consciousness and sent a message to friends, allies, and enemies, including those overseas. He stuck huge posters on his car. Each one was large enough to cover an entire car door, with 2 words on each poster: Black Power. Now, the words Black Power and in the boldest type font that he could find. That was a major reflection of the effect coming from George, him reflecting it. It was a reflection of the effect that 𝘑𝐤𝐺𝐬𝑄, who was Trinidad born, had on our national consciousness, as well as he had a major impact on the international consciousness of all peoples, more or less. And the consciousness that arose when he introduced Black Power as a rallying cry into the United States civil rights movement. That took place at a rally in Greenwood in the southern part of the United States on June 16, 1966. Now, when George put up those signs on his car, his advisors, legal advisors, and other advisors to the OWTU pleaded with George to take them off of his car, take off those signs. But while George listened to advisors, he processed what they had to say within his own intellect, his ideological inclinations, and very critically, his people instincts. If it's one thing you learn about George, is that his people instincts are very, very strong. So he kept the posters on the car. And there were many indications of how right George was to do so. Many indications of the extent to which he was tuned into the grassroots and the society generally, and the workers who are the major section of the society that he represented. One indication of his rightness appeared on Quarry Street in East Port of Spain, just one block away, Quarry Street, from Oxford Street, the street on which Kwame Ture was born. And the sign that appeared on a wall, a large wall, painted in huge letters, it proclaimed, "Without equal rights, Black is dangerous." So when you look at what George did with the posters, when you look at what the grassroots section of the community did with a wall in their community in East Port of Spain, then you realize that George was in sync with the way that many of us in this society felt about that term, Black Power, that war cry, that rallying cry, Black Power. And the sign on Quarry Street said, "Without equal rights, Black is dangerous." The foundation of George's ideological outlook, and consequently, it had been shaped fundamentally by many experiences, the most potent of which embodied white racism. He encountered it in a deeply personal way in his childhood. He encountered it as a soldier in the British Army in World War II. And he came face to face with it as a worker in the oil fields and later as a union leader in that industry. In all these experiences of life, he had very powerful experiences of white racism and what it meant to people of his color. George Weeks was born and, except for a brief period, grew up in Togo. He grew up mainly with very strict father and his parents separated. That led him to have well-appreciated vacations outside of Togo, between his mother's home, which was on Sackville Street in Port of Spain, and his Aunt Ollie in Bossier. And you know, it's kind of significant because not far from Bossier, you had, which he observed, was a very different type of housing to what George knew in Togo and what he experienced in the East Dry River community. So right away, it struck him that kind of material difference, the difference in material reality, because between some people who did not look like him or us and others, that you could just see from the housing structures in which they live. That was just one indication. Both his rural and urban experiences made him sharply aware of racism and inequality in the society. In Togo in the early 1900s, a headmaster enjoyed great respect and exercised strong moral authority in the community. And George was the son of a headmaster in Togo at that time. The headmaster, at the same time, was diminished by the authority of the white Anglican priest. The priest represented British authority, and the Anglican school was the priest's school. So George's proud father could not even leave the village without the consent of this white priest. However, the young George was able to recognize that his father was not just taking things lying down. George heard snippets of conversation when his father took him to Port of Spain and had intense meetings with other teachers and headmasters. From where he, that is George, sat outside, he could hear the anger and anguish in the voices, the condemnatory tone about the way they were treated by the white colonial authorities, about the system. They were also, condemning the system. And more importantly, he heard them expressing a determination to organize and collectively do something about it. The idea of organizing on the basis of collective interest and strategizing to achieve goals remained with him. That became part of the forte of George. As a teenager in the late 1930s, he would be influenced as well by a few significant national organizations. Among them, the Negro Welfare, the Negro Workers Social and Cultural Association, which was led by Christina King and Jim Barrett. George's ideological development had also been shaped by World War II. It was shaped by the trigger of the war, that attempt at mass extermination in a very systematic way, the Germans seeking to exterminate those who call themselves Jews. It was also shaped by the bloody nature of the war itself, as well as his experiences as a soldier. He had personal experiences as a soldier that also shaped the way he thought about the world, the way he thought about society. Because George had joined the British Army stationed in Trinidad and Tobago, and while here, he enjoyed his army life. When they asked for volunteers to go overseas as part of the war effort, George volunteered. He had that spirit of a fighter in him. And seeing that he was upset about what the Nazis were doing, he was prepared to go and join that battle against injustice. His interpersonal experiences in the army brought him face to face with white racism. He was no longer an observer, he was now caught up in it and feeling the sting of it in a personal way. In Cairo, there was a lot of discrimination, intense discrimination against continental Africans. And that was by fellow soldiers. George and fellow Caribbean soldiers stood up on behalf of the continental Africans. The avid reading that George did in this period, he read everything he could put his hand on, also expanded his political thoughts. And maybe I should say about George is that he did not get beyond, the first few years of secondary school, which he had to go into town to attend. But he had that love for reading, which he never lost. And that is one of the factors in George's development to the kind of intellectual that he became. Sometimes people think that if somebody doesn't have a university education or something, they're not an intellectual. I just want to make it clear that if you had any experience of George, you would understand what an intellectual that he was. Importantly too, that influenced his political thought, because one of the things that the army afforded him was time to read, and he did read a lot. Another influence on George, and that comes in the war again, is that it struck a blow against certain things that, we internalize, and particularly in that period. And what happened is that two false images that he had in his mind fell by the wayside. One was the carefully cultivated image of a basically harmonious white world. Because whereas, people talk about us, we fighting each other and all that, the white world was portrayed to us as though it was, everything was smooth. The other thing that fell apart in his view of the world is that image of the superiority of whites. One of the factors in this, again in the war, while he was in Egypt, he got the opportunity to see the pyramids. And when he looked at the pyramids, he looked at the other monuments in Egypt that had survived from the ancient period. That opened his eyes to the glories of Africa. And that was another shaping, so it was not just oppression again, but it was also the pride in collective ethnic achievement. And I want to quote from him. He said, "I went to the war as a Black man fighting for his Black pride and a human being fighting for the humanity of our planet." That is the type of, you see, the personal pride and also his linkages to human beings, who anything that has to do with justice and humanity was what George was all about. During the war, the experience of debate about political and economic systems was also part of the dialogue that he got involved in, as well as what he was reading about. So all the issues of, capitalism versus socialism and so on became part of his thought, things that he was now digesting intellectually and able to debate and discuss. Later on, working in the oil fields and personally experiencing what it was to be an exploited worker, as well as a human being, further diminished by white bosses. And they did this to all who were Black, because there was no respect for us as a people. So George had to endure that kind of experience as a worker in the oil industry. He also drew from progressive national leaders of the time. Well, we all know that I think his strongest affinity was to Uriah Buzz Butler. Now, I said all this to tell you why that idea of Black power would have had a strong appeal to George that it did, which accounts for him putting it on the car and not listening to his advisors. So the other area I was asked to tackle in this discussion is the 1970 period. And George Weeks was very much a part of that. He was very much a part of all the issues that led up to the formation of the National Joint Action Committee, of which I was a part. And he was a great contributor to the work of the Black Power movement. The relationship that had been built up all in this 1967-68 period, a relationship was built between the Guild at that time at the University of the West Indies and the progressive trade unions. Those with whom you'd have had the best relationship would have been the OWTU. And at that time, I was a student, I was part of the Students' Guild. The Transport and Industrial Workers Union, as well as a union of food, beverages, and allied workers, which was headed by a president. He was Francis Bedu. Well, 𝘞𝐿 everybody would know because he was head of the Transport and Industrial Workers Union, and Clive was one of the senior officers in that union as well. So we got involved. I remember us marching in 1968. You had a march against the Industrial Stabilization Act, the introduction of that act. And this is one of the strongest collections, strongest gathering of trade unions that I have ever seen in this country. I don't think I've seen anything to surpass it, that demonstration against the Industrial Stabilization Act. And because we had been building a relationship with the unions, for example, George Weeks, 𝘞𝐿, Nunes, and so are people whom we would invite onto the campus because we always sought to build a relationship between the university students and people whom we saw as important for the development of the society outside of the university. Is my time up?
Brother Kanbon, you have a minute again, so you can wrap up.
All right, so coming out of that relationship, we ended up in some very dramatic situations, and George proved his courage. I have said it in a past lecture. When we had to go on, when we decided to block buses, when they tried to break a strike, George and 𝘞𝐿 were the last to be dragged off the bus. George was the last, and George really got a lot of blows trying to hold on to that bus. I'll say one more incident, which I said before as well, and that ends so people understand George. When we were in prison in 1970, George came face to face with a very nervous policeman holding an SLR in his hand, and it was pointed straight at George's chest. And I believe that George's life, and our lives as well, was only saved because George just looked him straight in the eye and never blinked until it was called off. I'm happy for this opportunity to say something about one of the great nationals of Trinidad and Tobago, George Weeks.
Thank you very much, Brother Kanbon, for that deep insight into the early life of Comrade George Weeks. Our second panelist is Dr. Jerome Luxing, and I'll just give a short bio on Dr. Luxing. He has served on the Board of Governors of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. He has also published articles on the working class personalities, including Tubal, Uriah Butler, George Padmore, Marcus Garvey, and Walter Rodney. Luxing has organized seminars on 𝘔𝐸𝐿 𝐿𝐼𝐸𝐿 and Dr. Rujanath Kapildeo. He also published short articles in the Vanguard focusing on trade unions involved in Black Power. His major contribution is labor and the decolonization struggle in Trinidad and Tobago. He has been invited to speak at the Conference of Delegates of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, the All Trinidad Sugar and General Workers Trade Union, and the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs, and the annual National Convention of the Communication Workers Union as well. He has also addressed a conference of shop stewards and branch officers, what we know as CASABO meetings of the National Trade Union Center of Trinidad and Tobago. It gives me great pleasure to welcome as our second panelist, Dr. Jerome T. Luxing. And just a reminder for participants, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the chat box. Dr. T. Luxing, the floor is yours.
Dr. Henry Shea, thank you for that very nice introduction. Fellow panelists, Brother Kanbon and Comrade Aussie, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be invited here to be part of this very important milestone. I want to thank the librarian of the OWTU library for assisting me with some of the research material. And I was so glad that Brother Kanbon spoke about that link with the university, that link between the trade union movement and the university, because it is not there, not just here at St. Augustine, but it's not on 𝑘FIL, it's not there at Guyana, it's not there in Jamaica, and it is something that we need, right? Many of these academics, just as Walter Rodney was grounded, we need that grounding with the trade union movement. So I hope that era could return. If Comrade Weeks was alive today, I wonder if there would be any lockdown on Labor Day. I don't think any prime minister or state of emergency would have been able to prevent that great rebel, the head of the rebel movement, from marching on the 19th of June. Brother Kanbon spoke about that policeman and the gun and George Weeks being brief. And this was the man that I have heard about so much as a young student in primary school and as a teenager. And he's very much a legend, often a myth, part of the legend of the trade union movement. And whilst I was doing research on George Weeks's life, I realized how the past has influenced the present, or should I say the present is tied so closely to the past. We had a major division in the trade union movement, just as we had NATUC and Phyton. We had the Trinidad and Tobago National Trades Union Congress. And just as today, we have tribal politics where race and ethnicity was important, it played a major role. And it was that tribal politics that made the ULF, United Labour Front, gain only 10 of the 36 seats in the 1976 elections. And George Weeks failed to win his seat because of that ethnic voting. So it's very interesting to see that influence still of the tribal politics. Brother Kanbon mentioned the Industrial Stabilization Act of 1965. And it was unions such as the OWTU and other union leaders who put the Williams regime under intense pressure. And they actually had to concede, and they ended up passing the Industrial Relations Act, IRA, 1972. And very interestingly, Weeks was not part of meetings at a tripartite conference in 1970. And Weeks was not part because the OWTU was not affiliated with the Trinidad and Tobago Labour Congress, and he said that this conference, the tripartite conference, was a sellout, because they did not get rid of the ISA and some of the amendments were not suitable for the union movement. So Weeks was very vociferous, and said his mind. And one thing I've noticed with Comrade Weeks was that he not only represented oil workers, he was one of the major voices of the working class. Comrade Weeks argued for the revolutionary transformation of the economy. He didn't just want nationalization of the industries, he wanted the trade union movement to be treated with respect. Weeks was a giant, not just in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, but internationally. He was respected. And from my research and from some of the interviews that I have done, I have started to believe that Eric Williams feared George Weeks. Weeks overshadowed this little Eric Williams. And I will give you one illustration of why I believe so. In December 1978, Williams sent Errol Mahabe, the Minister of Petroleum and Mines, to meet with Comrade Weeks at his union's office in Paramount Building in San Fernando. Why did this meeting occur? Because George Weeks sent a very strong letter to the PNM government, to Eric Williams, regarding Texaco. So it was very strange for a senior cabinet minister to come down to the union office in Paramount Building. And what this did, it made Weeks, in the eyes of the public now, a powerful piece in this game of chess. It was a time of petropolitics, the 1960s and 1970s. Oil was important. And Eric Williams knew what Weeks was capable of. He knew about the union support. Oil was king. So Eric Williams was very careful in his relationships with George Weeks. And what is very interesting, that even though I'm saying, he was fearful of Weeks, Williams treated the OWTU with disrespect. During the Black Power movement, the police went into that library at OWTU and they took away material that was considered seditious, communist, Marxist, radical. They took away files, minutes, confidential documents from the OWTU library. So it showed how Weeks was considered a threat. Weeks was considered someone who was dangerous. And I'll tell you what, Weeks was able to fight with Williams, not just because he was a brave person. He was willing to fight with the lions for the sake of the people, for the working class. And there's a quote that Weeks said, and I'll say this quote to you all. I quote, "They are the government, right or wrong, and what I am doing isn't in my own interest," end of quote. And Weeks said this because sometimes he sat down and he negotiated with the government. He negotiated with the labor ministers. It wasn't just Eric Williams who feared Weeks. The United States had their interest in oil. They were also concerned about the spread of communism and Marxism, radical ideology. Remember, this is an era of Fidel Castro, Maurice Bishop. We had Cheddi Jagan from the 1950s, who had this philosophy that was anti-capitalist. And I was in the archives in Maryland in the United States about 10 years ago, and I came across some declassified files in which the CIA was closely monitoring the union, OWTU, and other radical union leaders. And in these files, the United States Embassy in Port-au-Spain was regularly sending information on unions back to the Secretary of State in Washington. Much of the correspondence was talking about the OWTU's struggle for wage increases, Black Power era, protest activities, and they also mention, of course, Texaco. Some of George Weeks' statements, newspaper clippings were also sent back to Washington. So United States had their eyes on Comrade Weeks, on the President General at that time. And I will give you one illustration. March 1975, the United States Embassy in Port-au-Spain sends a telegram entitled, "Labor Leader Alleges US Intervention." And in that telegram, they quote Weeks as saying, this is what Weeks is saying, "The American government, through its multinational corporations, is planning to use Trinidad as a base of subversive activities against Venezuela," end of quote. So Weeks was not someone, who was just dealing with the local government here or the regional government. He was somebody who was considered a person of interest. He was considered someone who could have threatened the status quo and someone who, they had to keep their eyes on. And many of us know about George Weeks in the ULF, his time in the Senate, but very few of us know that when the NAR government won the elections in 1986, George Weeks also served as a senator during that time. And it was that time in which I think it gave him the greatest pain. It was a time of sorrow, from what I'm gathering, because he felt betrayed. Many people accused George Weeks. I saw some of the articles in our local newspapers. They accused him of being too old to serve in the Senate. Some of them accused him of being a sellout because he was part of the government. And I'll tell you something, the governments and the opposition, not just in Trinidad, but other countries, they tend to use labor leaders as a showpiece, as a front. Some of you all might know that the PNM government had persons such as Vernon Glean, Nathaniel Critchlow, and also a former President General of the OWTU, John Rojas. They were part of the PNM government as senators. So anytime you served with the government, you might be seen as a sellout. And the NAR government had won elections and they had George Weeks there, not as an elder statesman, but to advise them on trade union issues, on labor issues. And he was attacked, he was accused by others, as being a sellout. But from my interpretation, George Weeks, while serving as a senator for the NAR, he was someone who was patriotic. He was a nationalist. And I'll tell you why. After the coup, the July 1990 coup, George Weeks did not abandon the government. George Weeks stayed with the government. He defended A&R Robinson. Now, for those of you all who know the history and those of you all who lived through the history, many of the trade unions were against some of the policies of the NAR government, right? They were concerned about the increase in taxes. They were concerned about cola being touched. So that all these made George Weeks feel a bit attacked. He was being humiliated. His name was being dragged through the media. Why has he abandoned the trade union movement? But Weeks stayed. He stayed with the NAR government. So I want us to, whilst we are interpreting George Weeks in his later years, especially as a senator for the second time, we have to understand his role. We have to understand that he was not a sellout. He stayed with the government. And he also stayed with the government when Basdev Pandey broke away. Basdev Pandey broke away and formed Club 88. You all would remember he broke away with John Humphrey and others, and he broke out and he left A&R Robinson. Comrade Weeks stayed, the leader of the rebel movement, the leader of the working class, the hero of the working class from an earlier era, stayed with the government. And this also made him, appear as somebody who was seen as a sellout. So it's difficult, to understand the politics at that time. And I'll give you a recent bit of history too. During the People's Partnership, when the MSJ had pulled out, Errol MacLeod, a former President General, stayed with the government, and he was also, for many unions seen as betraying the working class. So it's very difficult. It's part of our recent history. It's part of our past too. Maybe one day I might become Prime Minister and I might appoint Comrade Roger or Comrade Ozzy as a senator, and they might have to reject it, right? And I want to encourage the OWTU and other unions to ensure that the legacy of George Weeks is properly interpreted. I also want to encourage all trade unionists to ensure that that idea of a hero's park becomes a reality. Since 2011, Cabinet had approved that this hero's park and museum be built in Fyzabad. So I want to ensure that it becomes a reality. I know that the union is very progressive and the college, so I know that this will soon occur. And George Weeks was a trade unionist par excellence. He was a revolutionary, a radical, not someone of mere rhetoric. He walked the talk. And Weeks' life can positively shape our trade union movement. Our trade union movements, our trade union leaders need to be more fearless like Weeks. We need to be a fighter for the rank and file. We need to be a fearless voice for the working class. George Weeks was the ultimate rebel. And if George Weeks was alive today, I am certain George will not stay quiet when he would see so many of our union leaders and our trade unionists didn't get the vaccine yet. Weeks would have been very concerned to know that some of us might be getting inferior vaccines, some of us are getting questionable vaccines. Weeks was a voice for the working class. He would not want to see our people waiting so long for these vaccines. And I want to warn all trade unions to be on the right side of history. Future citizens and future researchers will not be kind to anyone who stay quiet during times of injustice. Do not be afraid to disturb the status quo. George Weeks disturbed the status quo. He paid a price, but he has remained the hero of the masses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. T. Luxing, for that insightful look into the life of Comrade Weeks. Just to point out a couple of the things that stood out for me. You mentioned that he was a major voice of the working class who looked at general welfare of workers and the health of the economy, and he was also considered a threat to the status quo, meaning that he was more concerned and fearless about his representation of the working class. So thank you very much for that reminder. Our next panelist is none other than, let me pull up his very long bio. I know he's laughing, right? Our next panelist is no stranger to most of us in the trade union movement. His name is Aussie Warwick, and he's currently the Chief Education and Research Officer and Executive Trustee of the OWTU. He is also the General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement and the Movement for Social Justice. He's an elected member of the Financial Control Committee and Presidential Council of the World Federation of Trade Unions and the Secretary of the Industrial Global Union in the Caribbean region. He currently chairs the local organization committee for the Assembly of Caribbean People. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our third panelist, Comrade Aussie Warwick. Well, I could call you Aussie, right? So, yes.
Of course, Comrade Marsha. And good afternoon, everyone. And of course, good afternoon to Dr. Andre Henry, Director of the Cipriani College, and to my President General, Comrade Ansel Roger, brother and Comrade Kafra Kanbon. Good afternoon to you. Comrade Dr. Jerome T. Luxing. I see you've been given that great honor as well. Good afternoon to all. And let me just say it quickly before I start that, Jerome, I would hope that you would become Prime Minister one day. And secondly, you can be rest assured that both myself and Comrade Roger will be rejecting any request for an appointment. This afternoon, we at OWTU, we are proud to be part of Celebrated and joining the rest of the labor movement in recognizing the 100th anniversary of the birth of this great leader, national leader, not just a labor leader, but a national leader, Comrade George Weeks. Comrades would remember that in Comrade Roger's Labor Day feature, and he mentioned it again in his opening remarks, that in recognizing the legacy of Comrade Weeks, he said that Comrade Weeks understood the importance of the people owning and controlling the commanding heights of the economy, which really led to the nationalization of a major part of our energy sector, but also nationalization across the board. And today I would like my presentation to focus a little deeper on that on Weeks' struggle against the multinationals and his struggle for the ownership of public goods. And that is important because it's very relevant in terms of the pursuit right now by the current government, a pursuit of neoliberal policies that really seeks to strip away the ownership of the resources of this country from the people, wrested from the hands of the people of this country. So I would like to focus on that bitter struggle against the multinationals. And in doing so, I'd like to use the opportunity to read for you all several documents, never before heard of documents. These are the words of Comrade Weeks himself in his bitter struggle. And one of the things that underlies that struggle is the question of consciousness. The question that how do you raise the consciousness of an entire society to that deep, profound understanding that the people must have control and must benefit from the resources of that said country. And it is that question of consciousness that really is at the fundamental level. At a fundamental level is what drove Comrade Weeks and is what also drove the blue-shirt army that surrounded him. And in the way I'm going to present it as I talk about these struggles, I want to also recognize the comrades who around Comrade Weeks, the workers themselves who fought these bitter battles. Now, when Comrade Weeks would have been elected on the 25th of June, 1962 as the 3rd President General of OWTU, and within months of taking office, the British multinational BP informed the union that they're going to retrench workers by February of 1963. And on February 16th, as both speakers, Comrade Kafra Kanbon as well as Dr. Luxing, talk about the boldness of Comrade Weeks. Comrade Weeks gave BP 24 hours to withdraw their threat. And on the 17th of February, 1963, 2,600 BP workers went on strike. That strike was to last a marathon 57 days. It was the first major strike since independence. So immediately, Weeks and the warrior workers were sending a clear message that they are ready to take on the multinationals. Now, at the beginning of 1965, January 30th, Comrade Weeks, in addressing the 3rd biannual Congress of Delegates of the National Trade Union Congress, had to say this. He said, "We in Trinidad and Tobago are caught in this worldwide net of capitalist exploitation. No bargaining, no improved benefits, no pension plans. None of that will improve the overall situation. What is needed is political action so that we in this country can control our affairs and find a way to reap the benefits of the country's wealth without the help of the foreigners. What I say will be regarded in many quarters as heresy and subversive talk. For generations, workmen were taught to regard unionism as something disgraceful and wrong. We are only beginning to recover from the careful conditioning and beginning to realize generally that there is no finer cause than the cause of organized labor." So that is the level of consciousness I was talking about. And that was 1965. In 1965, there was also another attempt by the working class to unite under Weeks. And this is when the sugar workers turned to George Weeks to assist them in response now to such an act of unity and what we call ethnic solidarity. PNM government declared a state of emergency on the 18th of March, 1965. And therefore, by declaring a state of emergency, what the Williams government sought to do was to prevent sugar workers from being led by progressive trade unionists. Now, right after that, they would introduce the Industrial Stabilization Act, which amongst other things outlawed strikes. And we would have heard Comrade Kanbon talk about the ISA. You know what Comrade Weeks called the ISA? He called it, and I'm reading from an interesting pamphlet here, he called it the ISA Pig Justice. So this pamphlet which he wrote, ISA is the capitalist power structure presents pig justice. And he says in that pamphlet, "But let it be said, and let all concerned be warned, that the foundation of a labor code for Trinidad and Tobago is the repeal of this pig law, Industrial Stabilization Act 1965 to 1967, representing pig justice in modern day Babylon." Again, another example of the deep level of consciousness that Comrade Weeks had, which I was happy to hear Comrade Kafra Kanbon, giving us an idea as to what led him to be that conscious. Another momentous event was the battle in 1967 to save the livelihood of thousands of workers at BP and Shell, because their jobs were being threatened with retrenchment. And this time, BP said they wanted to retrench no less than 1,500 workers, and Shell 350 workers. A massive campaign led by Comrade Weeks was launched to save the jobs and to cry out around the oil fields, "Not a man must go." I'm sure many comrades who are still alive today who would have been part of that struggle remember that slogan, "Not a man must go." In 1968, Weeks gave a fiery speech in Santa Flora, where he called on the workers of BP to stand by, to take over BP. Those are the words of Comrade Weeks. The media vilified Comrade Weeks, both The Guardian and Express, something that hasn't changed even to today in 2021. But he responded in a letter to the editor, and here's what he told his critics. He said, "Anything is illegal which is against the law." Whose law? Law made by one class to protect themselves against the other classes. Laws the ruling class makes are always in the interest of the ruling class, the exploiting class, and are always against the exploited class, the working class. The working class cannot remove this yoke of exploitation without breaking these laws. The action they take will always be illegal. The right to take such action depends on whether it is justified in the workers' interest. Revolutions are never legal, but are often justified. That was Comrade Weeks' response to his critics. The OWTU under Comrade Weeks submitted also a lengthy memorandum to a commission of inquiry appointed to investigate the oil industry. And contained in that memorandum was an analysis of the oil industry. And in that document, Comrade Weeks called for a national oil company. And that would have been as far back as 1968. So it was Comrade Weeks' position that the existence of foreign oil companies in Trinidad was unjust. And when you think about it right now, we have BP, BHP Billiton, BG, we have Shell. So what he was trying to say and to build consciousness was that these companies were reaping the benefits of Trinidad's oil wealth in the form of enormous profits, while most ordinary people were still forced to endure poor working and living conditions. The OWTU under Weeks therefore promoted the establishment of a local oil company. The reasoning behind this campaign was that a locally owned company, the country's oil wealth would be used to benefit its people. Now, it was only later that the government actually took George Weeks' advice and bought out Shell and established the Trinidad and Tobago Oil Company. And this was a crucial achievement for George Weeks, the OWTU, and the country. So this growing consciousness of the people would soon be demonstrated with the bus strike in 1969, and we would have heard Comrade Kanbon spoke a lot about that period, so I would not reiterate that too much, only to say that then just 1 month before the 21st of April 1970, Weeks delivered a lecture to the Catholic Teachers Association on the 19th of March 1970. And here's what he said. He ended that lecture by saying, "But even if for ideological or religious reasons, any of you object to a socialist economy, yet there is still the possibility of doing something here. Once we have been able to throw off the mental shackles of our master, our government can move, for example, pass laws prohibiting the flow of money out of this country. Foreign companies can be made to spend or save their profits in Trinidad. If this is done, the money spent here will go into circulation. The money saved here will be invested here. All this will help employment. All this will make us strong. Forward to the revolution." Next came a crisis at the other multinationals. It wasn't just in oil. You had Dunlop, you had FedChem. And then in that sort of hostility as Weeks battled and struggled against these multinationals. And for what really? It really was because he wanted to show that ordinary people, workers, the people of this country have to gain control of the means of production. That was critical because the means of production and the mode of production were in the hands of multinational. Now, on July 13, 1971, police for a second time in a year raided the union's headquarters. And Comrade Jerome T. Luxing would have mentioned that they seized the records, etc. Now, after his release, Comrade Weeks gave a message at a Thanksgiving service at Mount Moriah Baptist Church on the 15th of October, 1972, where he made his famous statement. And as I read this statement made by Comrade Weeks, I am making it in the context of today's attack on the OWTU. He says, to attack the OWTU is not just to attack its members, but also the people of this country. Whether some like it or not, it is the OWTU in the main that today prevents our limited democracy from moving into complete dictatorship. The OWTU did not drop from nowhere. It was born out of struggle, blood, sweat, and tears to defend the poor and the oppressed. Therefore, any government, any man that elects to play the role of Judas and dares to attack the OWTU for defending the cause for which it was born, attacks an organization of the people, by the people, and for the people, and protected by God. For it is written and proven to those with eyes to see and familiar with our history that he who attempted to destroy the OWTU ends destroying himself. That was how passionate he felt about the role of this Oilfield Workers Trade Union. But during the second state of emergency in 1972, when Weeks was in prison, they would have passed the IRA. And that really, another piece of legislation that included clauses to prevent workers from striking in essential services. It legislated against union representing workers in more than one essential industry, and in effectively limiting the number of companies that an individual union could represent. I want to also draw reference to 1975. This would have been just after the Bloody Tuesday, which took place in March, at the 36th Annual Conference of Delegates. And this question of nationalization came up because in that critical resolution, there were calls, it was called the Resolutions of Protest and March Towards Economic Liberation. And it says that, whereas even so conservative a Governor General as Sir Alice Clark has been forced after a patriotic struggle and positive action taken from March 12 to April 27, 1975 against Texaco, Trinidad, to accuse multinationals pursuing destructive policies, resulting in a situation where the present international economic order has been tried, convicted as an audacious impostor. And it goes on to say, it further resolved that this conference calls on all organized progressive organizations, patriotic individuals, and the people of Trinidad and Tobago in general to stand up now and join with us in our long but just and patriotic march, demanding total nationalization of all foreign-owned and controlled companies. That was the position of Comrade George Weeks. He would struggle with the multinationals throughout the 70s, leading straight into the 80s. And he never gave up. In 1979, the very famous Texaco Must Go campaign was launched. And you know what is interesting? That was in 1979. He was vilified for that. It reminds me of the current President General when he said, if you're not willing to follow the laws of the country, take your ring and go. And he was vilified, not only by right-wing media, but even by persons who supposedly know better. But it was in that spirit of understanding that multinationals cannot come here and violate the laws of our country, reap the benefits, reap huge profits, and just do what they want. So I think that that spirit of continuing to battle for the ownership, the control of the commanding heights of the economy persisted. The struggle by Comrade Weeks went on even in the, not just in oil and energy, but we had CPI in February 81. You had CPI workers responded to a dismissal. They went on strike. You had also Unilever, major struggle at Unilever. That would have been in 1978. That was another multinational in manufacturing. A bitter strike that lasted for 4 weeks, and it signaled a wave of militancy amongst workers in the north. So that you see Comrade Weeks not just leading workers in the southern energy belt, but he was leading workers across the country against these multinationals. I want to begin to wrap up a bit. And I want to again quote from a paper that when Comrade Weeks wrote to the Prime Minister in 1985, and he talked about imperialism. Imperialism is the enemy. And he was talking about CPI being anti-worker, metal box, and so on. And here's what he said under the section, Agents of Imperialism. In light of what I briefly outlined above about the enemy imperialism and the agents operating in Trinidad and Tobago, I, on behalf of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union and all those who seek the national interest, urge and appeal, Mr. Prime Minister, for a closing of the national ranks against imperialism with its latest infamous plots. We are for peace because we are for justice. We are defending the right to work, a right that is enshrined in Article 23 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the modern Magna Carta, which states that everyone has the right to work. By defending the right to work, we are not only seeking to protect workers' rights, but also to ensure justice for all. That was the kind of person Comrade Weeks was, a deep, conscious leader who understood the importance of how a society should be structured, and in that structuring of that society, the role of local ownership. Now, the battle against multinationals led by Comrade Weeks, whether it was Amoco, BP, Tesoro, Shell, Fedchem, Dunlop, CPI, Metal Box, Lever Brothers, they were long and difficult battles. I read it out because I really want all the comrades listening to this to understand the magnitude of that leader and as well as the workers that stood around him. We must never forget that. There were many sacrifices, but these battles laid the groundwork for strong collective agreements and workers' rights, which all of us benefit from. 40-hour work week, allowances, leaves, pension plans, medical plans. And we have, which is why it's important in our current dispensation to rally behind the current leadership in order to defend and protect those gains that Comrade Weeks and the warrior workers of the past would have helped secure. It is our job now to protect and defend that. Comrade Weeks felt that ordinary working people, as ordinary working people, we must be treated with dignity and that we have a right, a decent and permanent job and should not be treated as though they are thrown crumbs and treated as though it is a gift from someone. It is our right to have at least a decent standard of living. As I close, I want to read from Comrade Kafra Kanbon's book. It's really a classic, For Bread, Justice, and Freedom. And I suggest anyone who wants to build their consciousness, get a copy of For Bread, Justice, and Freedom. It is a great piece of literature, a great piece of history that will really help you in building your consciousness. And in that is closing, this is his closing paragraph. Here's what Comrade Kanbon had to say. He's speaking about Comrade Weeks. His was the fate of a man with a dream of freedom, a dream of a just and equal new world. He dared to struggle for that dream, a dream that was the hope of the dispossessed. But it was a dream which challenged the mighty and the powerful. The dream sowed the wind, and the bearer, fortunately with the strength to endure and triumph, reaped the political hurricane. Therefore, as we celebrate the 100-year anniversary of his birth, in the spirit of Comrade Weeks, I want to reiterate the words of Comrade Roger when he spoke at the on Labor Day, that we have to redouble our commitment to struggle towards the realization of Comrade Weeks' vision. We have to defend against the current attempt to dismantle and undo and reverse all of those gains which were important to ensure that we as a people stand tall with our heads high, with our dignity intact. A vision of we the people owning, controlling, and benefiting from the commanding heights of our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ozzy, for that very impassioned presentation. 2 takeaway points from your presentation that I would have gained was that Comrade Weeks would have worked towards nationalization of industries because it was felt that the multinational corporations were benefiting from our own resources and that the nationals, our citizens, need to benefit from our resources. And also he was responsible for one of the first major strikes in our labor history and in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. That's the BP strike of 1963. So I'm just reiterating those points. At this point, we have our question and answer segment for the panel, and I'm just awaiting a couple of the questions before we begin. Just a reminder for participants and for those who are viewing on our YouTube channel, feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and I will be able to ask the questions to our panelists as they come. So our first question is to Dr. Luxing. How important do you believe the work of the Cipriani College is in making that connection between academics and the labor movement? You will have to unmute your mic, Jerome.
Right. I think it is very important to ensure that the students and the staff at the college, including director, be aware of educating and empowering the personnel about the history of the trade union movement and also about some of the issues that the union is fighting for. And when I mean union, not just OWTU, but all unions. And what are these issues? Issues like poverty, unemployment, better health care, issues affecting education. So it's very difficult to take an active and a public stance because the college falls under the Ministry of Labor. So you wouldn't want any sort of victimization. Even me, I am working at UWI, so I'm very often careful. I need sometimes to bat in my crease, you know, because university is not a private independent institution. It falls under the Ministry of Education. But the role of the college should be to ensure that the public also is aware of how the working class is treated. Sometimes we are not even sure how to define the working class. So we need to be aware of the working class issues. We also need to be aware of ideologies. Often students pass through the college and they cannot give a proper definition of Marxism or communism or socialism. They don't even know the history of the radical left in the Caribbean or Trinidad and Tobago. So I think this is the role of the college to ensure that the people are empowered, the students and the public, but also that they are more acutely aware. There has been so much apathy, not just at the college, but sometimes at UWI and secondary schools, so much apathy concerning the trade union movement. Everybody knows about June 19th, but outside of that, there's a sort of ignorance, which is frightening. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I hope it does, and I agree with you with regard to the general apathy. I think that has a lot to do with our lack of embracing of that part of our history. It's not taught at the secondary schools in any great detail. And I think there are attempts at the tertiary level to do so, but it should start before to give our people that sense of where we have come from. I think that is very much lacking in our system. Our second question goes to any member of the panel who is willing to answer, any or all of you. The question is trade unionism and capitalism both paradigm shifting organizations? And the person is asking this question based on the trajectory that Comrade Butler was famous for the social solidarity of the barefoot workers during mercantile capitalism. Comrade Weeks took the baton from Comrade Butler when he used the 20th century Marxist ideology to change the capitalist organizational structure to accommodate workers' mobility and industrial relations in the workplace and workplace landscape. What are your thoughts on the issue? Would you like me to repeat that? Or, because I think it was a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah. Ozzy can tackle that, you know, we can repeat it and then Ozzy can go ahead first.
All right, I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it. Are trade unionism and capitalism both paradigm shifting organizations? And the person is asking the question based on the trajectory that Comrade Butler became famous for, the social solidarity of barefoot workers during mercantile capitalism. Comrade Weeks took the baton from Comrade Butler when he used Darren Hoff's 20th century Marxist ideology to change the capitalist organizational structure to accommodate workers' mobility and industrial relations in the workplace landscape. What are your thoughts?
All right. Well, first of all, capitalism is not an organization. It's a system. It's a system by which the capitalist class extracts surplus value from workers, and that surplus value goes towards them, to their benefits, and workers are provided with just a wage. And therefore, and within that is where the level of exploitation comes in. And this is where trade union jumps in. And this is why there is this attempt to really eradicate trade unions, because what trade unions in fact does, it assists the worker in retaining a majority of their surplus value. And they do so by not just the increase in wages, but also in terms of other benefits, whether it's vacation leave, whether it's sick leave, whether it's allowances, whether it's a good medical plan, whether it's a good pension plan, whether it could be a housing plan. All of that is part of the worker attempting to retain their surplus value and not being taken away from them from the capitalist class. And so I think one of the things that have been that current trade union leadership is pushing is the question of social justice and the social economy. In other words, how do we reorganize our economy away from the plantation the plantation model of our economy, whereby we have the capitalist class still extracted amassing huge amount of wealth while the rest of us getting scrubs. And what we see that is even worse is attempts now for those workers who are unionized, who do have at least some level of protection, who are able to retain at least a significant part of the value that they as workers create. What you have now is a neoliberal agenda by the government to eradicate trade unions so that they can then be able to take away or dismantle those support or those rights that workers have in order to retain their surplus value. I think that is what makes trade unions critical at this point, because trade unions are the only institutions that stand in the way of capitalists extracting more and more surplus value of your labor.
Thank you, Aussie. Jerome, do you have any thoughts on the issue?
I agree with what Aussie has been saying, and I think it is becoming even more difficult in today's world because of the rising levels of unemployment. You know, people are also becoming critical of capitalism too. So there's also this now, and they have these waves there throughout the 20th century, even during the Great Recession. You know, in 1930s, there was this outburst against capitalism, so that the neoliberalism, which is very much a reality, it's playing on even more, and we see it even in this deep division between the developed countries and the global south. So I think it is something that should be on the agenda of all trade unions, how to ensure, you know, that capitalism doesn't really undermine the workers at this stage.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Is Brother Kanbon still with us? While we're waiting for him to return. All right, yes, he is here.
I'm still
right. Right, there's a question.
Thing to add to that, because it's, you know, it's clear you have I'm not sure what is meant by paradigm shifting actually. I gotta, you know, the language, I'm not sure exactly what it means in the context of the unions and capitalism. What you have and you've had from the word go is a contradiction between one set of entities that are looking for profit and another group of entities, the unions, that are trying to extract the most for their workers. I don't know if paradigm shifting means that tension, that constant conflict you know, does lead to different paradigms or not. I'm not sure. That's what I don't know exactly what the question is aiming at.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's another question specifically for you. The question is, although the time did not allow you to mention it, what was the situation with the workers at the All Trinidad Sugar and General Workers Union wanting to join the OWTU?
Well, you've had from even before George came on the scene as a unionist, you have had that leaders like Butler, for example, Rienzi and so on, who have sought the unification in struggle of the sugar workers and the oil workers, because the heart of the labor situation for the Indian community is the sugar belt. And the oil oil field workers have been the most powerful union in the country and still remains the most powerful union in the country. So that the persons who have tried from the very earliest days to move the country forward have seen the importance of bringing together oil and sugar, which symbolically is like bringing together Indian and African at a worker level to fight for a better Trinidad, and Tobago. And I think we came very close to achieving that with the Black Power movement in 1970, because at that time, race relationships were very bad in the country between Africans and Indians, you know, because it's something that had kept rising and falling depending on who were the leaders at the time, who were dominant leaders at the time. And the Black Power movement was able to reach out and mobilize the Indian community against a background where the leader of the workers at that time in the sugar industry was an extremely backward leader, Badis Maraj. He was an anti-worker trade union leader and actually worked more for Tate and Lyle, the multinational, than he worked for the workers in that industry. So that created an opening for workers in the sugar industry to see that better can be done. And it could be done by the uniting of the two communities and bringing in more effective trade union leadership, whether the individuals happen to be Indian or African. And the success of that was reflected, one, in the Caroni March, when you had against what everybody believed could happen, that you could have 20, 30,000 Africans from the urban areas beginning a march in Port of Spain and going all the way down to Cuba and being welcomed in the Indian communities in that period. And that is against a background where Badis, realizing this could mean a loss of power for him, actually had people going through the areas and warning people that the Africans are coming here to rape the women, to steal your property. You had all that kind of propaganda. And at the same time, they were threatening us that is the Badis crew, that if we came down into the sugar belt, there'd be gunmen in the cane fields and people would be killed and all of that. So when you really mobilize a society, people fight against those threats. That's what people like George Weeks have done in order to build the trade union movement, fighting against those kinds of threats. People like Pandey, in his unionist day, had to fight against those kinds of threats as well, because Pandey was in direct conflict with Badis. And since we are talking about George, I should say that Badis actually tried to kill George. He had sent a gunman to kill George one evening, and I don't know if it was only an attempt, but this attempt was sort of became documented because the threat was always there. And it is by chance that George remained alive, because when George's son, before George reached home, and he often came home in the night, coming down from the south, and a little before he came, His son went out of the house to get something, and then ran screaming because he saw what looked like the barrel of a gun in the bushes, exactly where George would have come out his car when he parked it. And it is by his alert that caused the gunman to run. And this was just a little before George reached home. So you had that battle, and it was a very significant battle. And I am really saddened to see a kind of moving apart of the two main ethnic groups in the society again. And you definitely need the ideological response and also the response of commitment, because none of these things that happened and made a difference from the days of, whether it's from the early days of Rienzi and Butler and all of that, all the uniting of these groups took a tremendous amount of effort, and you need enough leaders committed to it for it to happen again.
Thank you very much, Brother Kafra. Two questions for Jerome. Your first question, well, actually just a request. Please discuss a bit more about the relationship between Weeks and Williams. And the second question is, how important was Joe Young for the success of the work that George Weeks did? So your first question or first request, please discuss a bit more about the relationship between Weeks and Williams.
Right. That relationship, you know, as I mentioned, was one of fear. You know, Williams feared Weeks. He also respected Weeks in a certain way. And I want to also believe too that Weeks did not want to do anything to jeopardize the union, right? The union was already under scrutiny, already under attack, you know, by Eric Williams. And when they had these major strikes, you know, when the oil refineries were shut down and things, and Williams sent the army to deliver gasoline and things to the gas stations, all these things show the amount of power, the tremendous power that George Weeks had. And he was well respected nationally across the island, and also in Tobago. So I think that Williams feared him a bit, you know. I believe that both men understood that they had a certain turf. What was very unfortunate was that, you know, when it came to voting times, you know, Weeks didn't get that support. His admiration and support didn't translate that, so that Williams knew that, you know, those who were marching against him would vote for him, would vote for the party. So it's a strange contradiction, it's an irony, it's a paradox that you are protesting against a government, but when it comes to voting, tribal politics kicks in, you know. So it's very difficult to really understand the way in which Williams was treating these leaders. And Williams did divide and rule, just as the British had divide and rule policies. Williams tried to keep the unions divided, just as he wanted to keep the oil and the sugar union divided, two of the major unions, but he also tried to keep the other unions that were becoming a bit more radical and progressive. He wanted to keep them divided. So it was a very important tactic of Williams to keep them divided, you know, and Weeks and others often understood that tactic. I want to also mention too that one time when Weeks was being arrested for one of the searches at the union, he actually cut his wrist and he shouted in the name of African and Indians, you know, masses. So he tried to establish unity, sometimes in a dramatic way, you know. He did that in front of the courthouse when he was being tried and was eventually freed. So he did that, you know, to try to exactly show he was for the people. The second question you asked about Joe Young and Weeks. And it's a very difficult question. And I just want to say that at that time, as it is today in 2021, there were personality clashes. There were ideological clashes then, those who were Marxist, communists, Maoists, socialists, but there were also personality clashes. And I get a sense that those from the northern unions and those from the southern unions, especially the OWTU, had a problem with personalities. And there was also accusations and allegations that unions were poaching. When I mean poaching, for those who don't know, you're taking away employees and from your union and bringing them into other union. So there were some accusations, but I believe that these men also had class solidarity at heart. They had a working class movement at heart for Labor Day marches. They were there, they united, but there were some personality clashes between the two men. So it's very difficult to assess that relationship between Joe and George, because I know that they were being manipulated by Eric Williams a lot at that time, right? So I don't know if that answers the question, but I sense there were some personality clashes.
All right, thank you very much, Jerome. Question for Aussie. The question is, what is the trade union movement doing at the present time to ensure what happened to the steel workers and petrotrain workers is not repeated in this country?
One of the main things is the recognition that you need unity, and that one trade union, one federation alone cannot embark on any struggle. And therefore, it's very important that we use as an example the Unite to Fight campaign. That is critical. The second thing is the question of legislation, labor legislation. We all saw the conditions under which those two pieces of legislation were passed, the ISA and the IRA, both under state of emergency. So that should tell you that these are legislations that are structured in a way to really make it even more difficult for workers. So in the case, for example, of both ArcelorMittal and Petrotrain, stronger labor legislation, especially with regards to the severance, Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act. That's a very important one. So I think unity, stronger legislation, I think greater consciousness amongst the workers. In other words, one of the things that Comrade Kanbon raised is, how do we go beyond, as Weeks did, just the membership, and having the country, the nation as a whole, understand that these struggles are not just about steel workers. These struggles are not just about oil workers, but these struggles are actually about Trinidad and Tobago and the future of Trinidad and Tobago. I think that is the new narrative that we have to show, that the WASA struggle is not just about WASA workers or TNTech workers. It's about the future, you know. It's about what is the life support infrastructure that we are going to leave behind for our children and children. That is I think one of the main things we have to do: build consciousness, strengthen trade union unity, and aggressively move to change labor legislation.
All right, thank you for that response, Aussie. Two general questions. The first one, given ArcelorMittal's judgment, the ArcelorMittal judgment, Parliament is yet to propose legislation to prevent a repeat of such events. Let me read that again. Given ArcelorMittal's judgment, Parliament is yet to propose legislation to prevent a repeat of such events. Please share your views on this issue, and this goes to any member or all members of the panel.
Yeah, well, that's a bit linked to my previous answer about the importance of changing labor legislation, especially the Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act, as well as, this is very important, company legislation like the Companies Act. So for example, under the Companies Act, if a company is liquidated, there's a list of priorities and workers are actually not on top. So what they do is, when they liquidate themselves, they pay off banks, they pay off creditors, and workers are down at the bottom. So we need changes around the accompanying legislation as well. And more than anything else, we need struggle on the ground. There is no substitution for militant struggle on the streets. There's absolutely no substitute for it. We can have the best arguments. And I said, I mean, as you said, Comrade Kafra, George Weeks was an intellectual. Incorrect. So we can have the best arguments. We can have the best intellectuals. We had a Labour's economic alternative plan that was developed, that was ignored. So there's no substitute than what Butler would say is brute force. And there are those who like to say trade unions should change their methods and so on. But they don't tell the capitalists, why don't you change your methods of exploitation? So they must maintain their method of exploitation. They must take away the terms and conditions of workers. They must violate workers' rights with impunity. They must have workers working in almost slave conditions in those factories. But we as unions, we as workers, taking collective action for our interest. And all of a sudden, we have to change that. No, based on the brutality unleashed on workers from the capitalist class, that I say is brute force, will have to also be our response. Maybe some persons may consider that subversive.
I just want to make one comment. It's
Sure.
that 𝐷𝐸𝐸𝐿, and I think that I think Aussie was part of the discussion somehow. I think I remember him in that, but the 𝐷𝐸𝐸𝐿 workers had come to the Emancipation Support Committee asking for support because they actually wanted to take over the company when it was abandoned. And just by chance, one of the persons whom we had here had access to people with capital and promised that it's an issue that she would raise and try to get investment to support the workers' takeover of the industry. But politics actually blocked it because the workers could not even get a hearing at the right governmental level, even when they had actual documentation in hand, because the person sent documentation, and they wanted, they had a point where they wanted to be able to come and make an assessment of what was left there to see what, to see whether or not they would invest, but they were very serious about investing in it. So sometimes the barrier is also at that political level. And perhaps if the unions had been able, which I know is an extremely difficult task outside of a special environment, but if they were able to get together and put a pressure on the government at the time, that situation might have had a different ending. But I know that is an extremely difficult thing, because remember, once when a government goes through a 1970 or anything similar, they gradually put a number of things in place to make it very difficult for there to be a recurrence. And we are in a situation where the government still feels very comfortable to not take the side of workers, even where the issue has some, it could be divorced from the politics and it could have positive national bearing. So I don't know who were the forces against that happening. I don't know if Aussie has any more information.
It's probably the same forces that are against the patriotic acquiring a refinery, because these are two classic examples of trade unions and workers doing something that was completely out of the box, where the workers are saying they want to own the means and the means, at least the means of production. But you are right, and that is something we have to confront and really talk about as a society. What forces are there that are hell-bent on maintaining the status quo, so that even if unions are able to come up with proposals and even the financing to really transform who owns the means of production, and even that is being stymied, even that is being prevented. We as a society must talk about that and we must confront that.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. One final question for all of the panelists. How can the lessons of Comrade Weeks be applied today to locally owned Trinidad and Tobago corporations, heavily internationalized and just as exploitative, owned by the sons and daughters of colonial privilege? I'll ask the question, I'll repeat it. How can the lessons of Comrade Weeks be applied today to locally owned TNT corporations, heavily internationalized and just as exploitative, owned by the sons and daughters of colonial privilege. Question directed to all members of the panel.
Right, Marsha, if I could start off.
Sure.
I want to just stray a bit from, putting Week's interpretation on it to say that I'm concerned about two things, and that is firstly, and it's debatable, the size of the salaries of some of these top officers of these state companies who continue to make these big salaries compared to the workers, but also when the companies are making losses. So I think this is something, if Weeks was alive, he would be concerned too, that, the salaries are so exorbitant and the workers are not making enough. They are struggling for the wage increases, finding it difficult to survive with this recession and retrenchment, and also the companies are making losses. And what I want to say secondly, and I wish George Weeks and others had dealt with it earlier so I wouldn't have to bring it up, because my students have been asking me it. Why anytime a government changes, that we have to change the CEOs of these state companies? Why can't we hire people on merit and qualifications? Why must it be somebody who has political allegiance? And if we have somebody who is qualified, and when I mean qualified, work experience, doesn't have to be a university degree. If we had somebody who is competent, qualified, those companies might be more efficient. But we have to get rid of this, where once a party comes into power, we change those in the embassies, we change ambassadors, and now we want to change CEOs, because that is the root of many of our problems, right? So I don't know if Brother Kafra and Comrade Ozzy has anything else to say on that.
I think we have to, well, first of all, we have to recognize the continued domination of multinationals in our current dispensation, right? Whether it's BP, BHP Billiton, BG, Shell, there are multinationals in even the retail sector. We see a proliferation of Starbucks and, well, a whole range of retail outlets, furniture. It's actually really becoming a dominant force in our society, not just in energy, but across the board. And then if you have the local elites as well that are there, who control the rest of the economy that the multinationals don't control. And this has to be a deep problem in terms of, you have this economy, but who is really owning and controlling this economy? That is a real deep question. And I mean, the state will come and they will read out their budget in terms of revenues, et cetera, et cetera. But then the revenue is based on taxes on profits, right? Which is 25 or 35% in terms of corporate tax. So a huge amount of profits are being made by entities within our economy. And we get some taxes from that. And then you have people like the Minister of Finance, Mr. 𝘔𝘰𝑯𝘥𝘢, who believe that he must squeeze everything and hold back everything. And, whatever happened to you, happened to you. And that has to be a fundamental problem. When banks could declare hundreds, think about this for a minute. I mean, we really have to confront this thing, If in the middle of a pandemic, and Comrade Roger mentioned that on Labor Day, hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, right? In a COVID, but calling you to pay your loan, pay your mortgage, pay your installment. Something has to be fundamentally wrong with that. Because thousands of people are left, they don't have a job, they're not sure how they'll pay rent, they're not sure how they'll find money to buy food. In the same economy, in the same society of 1.3 million people on a twin island republic, you have companies, corporations, multinationals making hundreds of millions of dollars. something has to be fundamentally wrong with that. And people can say what they want in terms of the trade unions should do this, trade unions, everybody like to, say what trade unions should do, but nobody is willing to say what you're doing. What are we, each one of us, confronting an economy like the one we have, where that fundamental contradiction exists, that deep inequality exists? How do we confront that together as a people?
Brother Kafra, any thoughts? You will need to unmute your mic.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Okay, I would say on the question of the CEOs and why it's changed when governments change. You see, we're in the world of realpolitik now, and state enterprises are seen as really state enterprises, not like the state as it's not like state on behalf of the people. It is state on behalf of those who have been elected into government office. That is the reality. And therefore, when changes take place, whatever use the state wants to make of corporations that are under the legal ownership of the state, you find that governments would look at that as an area, because remember, it's an area of resources for the state. The state wants to be able to give handouts to people, to buy people's loyalty with jobs and all of that, to do particular things that the state wants done. And therefore they feel that the CEO is an important position to hold on to. So it's unfortunate, but once the system remains what it is, I think it is what you are going to have. That's what the politics that we live under now, that's the system itself. The question of the problem, the managers who get the same salaries when companies are losing, that is another kind of question too, because you want, whether things are going up or down, you want to hold on to the people who are there, not necessarily because of competence, although I'm sure that a number of managers do have competence as well, but it's not necessarily about the question of competence. Again, is a question of loyalty. And if you are provided, you have a certain agreement that you have made, then you don't breach it, even when there might be a circumstance that says you should. And that's a part of politics that I don't understand, because if I'm in government, which I would never be, I never even want to be, I don't want to be near it, but you hire people to be state managers of a state enterprise, then they should have some loyalty to the person who is in the political position. Because by them agreeing to have a reduction in salary, it sets an example which also reflects on those who govern. But then those who are governing even when taxes are falling, because industries are collapsing. There may be situations in an international environment that are going against the economy. And you don't often see those in government changing their own salaries. And I feel if a situation is such that they have to enforce these changes in their CEOs, then as the major CEOs of the entire nation, they would have to set an example as well. So I could see reasons why you're not likely to see that kind of thing take place. These are not moral questions, I mean, there's a moral implication of it, but it will not be tackled or resolved on the basis of morality. It's based on it will be resolved on the basis of how alert the population is in these situations.
Thank you.
Let me just add very, very short, because I know we may have to wrap up.
Yeah, we have to wrap up in a bit. So
it is the loss of vision of a national project. What do I mean? during the 30s, the Butlerites had a vision of a national project, whether it was the right to vote, the nationalization, and so on. There was this vision of a national project based on a deep sense of belonging. So you have the Indians and Africans together, working together on a national project. In the 60s and 70s, Comrade Weeks and Williams battled over what that national project should look like, but at least they had a vision of a national project. All right, they disagreed on how it should be shaped and what it should entail, but there was at least some idea of a national project. That is lost amongst our current crop of politicians, and that has trickled down to state enterprise. So there is no national project, you know. It's about, if my party gets into power, can I get a position in one of the state enterprise to get a salary? That's it. We've lost that vision. And I would like to argue that that has to do with the many years of eradicating, slowly, but eradicating the level of consciousness. So that loss of a vision of a national project is now complete, is now entrenched throughout the society. And now we, as the current crop of progressive trade unionists, now have to find a way, a will, to really put back on the agenda that vision that we have of a national project.
All right, gentlemen, some closing remarks. What would be the most important lesson of George Weeks's contribution to the working class people? Each member has a maximum of a minute. I'll repeat the question, or for your closing comments. What would be the most important lesson of George Weeks's contribution to the working class people?
I would like to. Okay. Come on, Kanbon, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, mine is very short and simple. I think it is that real commitment to the workers, and also an ideological commitment to changing society. And the third thing I think is important is honesty. I don't know how many leaders you have with the kind of honesty that George Weeks had, even in a situation where he had access to the most financially powerful union in this country. And there are leaders who go and they bleed struggling unions. So I think that if you could only get that lesson across, it would be very, very important. But those are the three factors I see as critical.
Dr. Luxing?
I think that what we could learn from, George Weeks' life and contribution is his radicalism, his refusal to compromise his ideological beliefs. He was part of that Butlerite tradition that is dying or lost, and it needs to be revived. And one thing I have seen from the research and the archival work is that he had a certain amount of humility. He had a certain amount of humility, and even though, he was at the helm of the resistance, he was at the helm of the rebel movement, he had a certain humility that the rank and file appreciated, that the grassroots appreciated, and I think that should be returned amongst our working class leaders. Sometimes we just think about the radicalism, and the revolutionary traditions, but there's a certain amount of humility that gave him a charisma that it makes him one of the iconic trade union figures of the 20th century.
Aussie?
Comrade George Weeks had to grapple with the following questions. Who own and control the commanding heights of the economy? Who does it benefit? Who own and control the means and mode of production? And who defines the means of subsistence for the majority of our ordinary working people? And who should own and control the life support infrastructure of water, electricity, fuel distribution? And in resolving those questions and answering those questions, came to the unmistakable belief that a different society was necessary.
Thank you very much, Ozzy. I would like to take the opportunity now to thank all members of the panel, Dr. Luxing, Brother Kanbon, and Comrade Warwick, for their very insightful presentations on our topic today. Just a reminder to participants and to viewers, the series of these webinars continue tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The panel will be looking at the topic public goods, commodification, and equity. It's different from, just pay attention to the time, it's different from this afternoon's time. We started at 5 today. Tomorrow's session starts at 9 a.m. All right, there's still some time to register. You all can do so by clicking the link in the description box below. And also there is a feedback form that has been placed in the chat. We would like to ask members who were looking on at us, participants who are looking on at us, please feel free to type any comments or feedback in the chat. Thank you very much to all who are viewing. In closing, I'd like to thank again our panelists. I'd also like to thank Dr. Henry, Comrade Roger, the Institute of the Elma Francois Institute for Research and Debate, and the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, as well as members of the viewing public for their questions and their comments. Thank you very much for viewing our webinar today. I am Marsha Huggins, member of the adjunct faculty of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. Thanking you all so much for watching and for viewing and participating in our first webinar in the series, Weeks for Weeks. Thank you and have a good evening.